Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for today's discussion on the relationship between cloud expectations and reality or outcomes. We have an interesting format for this discussion, which will be a bit of a fireside chat. We're also going to save some time at the end to answer audience questions, so please feel free to submit those while we're having the discussion. My name is Liam Eagle. I'm a research director at S&P Global Market Intelligence's Technology, Media, and Telecoms Group. I'm a contributor to our cloud hosting and managed services research, and I also lead our enterprise and service provider survey research. I'm going to be speaking with Bryn Norton, who is VP of Managed Cloud Infrastructure Services at NTT Limited. Bryn, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, thank you, Liam. I'm very excited to be here today and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, sir.
Me too. So to start with, I'm going to share sort of our analyst's view of the market, which will hopefully provide some context for the rest of the conversation we're going to have. Starting at a very high level, a lot of our engagement with enterprises suggests that the pursuit of digital transformation and modernization are really critical initiatives for almost all organizations. In some of our most recent survey research, 93% of enterprises told us they were at some stage of developing a strategy or developing or executing a strategy for digital transformation. And 95% of us said that they had some degree of modernization effort in front of them, with 2/3 suggesting that that effort was going to be either large or very large in scope. And these efforts are about applying new technologies and adopting new data-centric strategies across the organization. And for many of them, this involves embracing cloud platforms and cloud operating models as really core to their IT operations. So this is going to span, public cloud platforms, hosted private cloud environments, systems that are operating on premises. It means adopting cloud native technologies and methodologies. It means public cloud platforms and hybrid and multi-cloud strategies. It also means new challenges. So for instance, with the complexity that comes as a side effect of, this huge variety of configurations and services that are available from the major public clouds. So we ask organizations what type of IT environments they consider their primary environments today and which ones they, see becoming their primary environments in 2 years. And the response to that illustrates what I think are a couple of key trends. One is a shift. So we see a decrease in the proportion of businesses that view, their legacy on-premises environments as their primary environments. And that goes from 19% to 8%. And we see, a pretty similar growth in the group that sees public cloud as their primary environment. The other trend we see, though, is some consistency. So where the portion that sees the more modern on-premises environments as their primary IT and venue, stays almost the same between now and 2 years out. And then the other message I think we see here is this, the idea of the coexistence of these environments, as many of these organizations are using multiple or all of these venues in combination and having to develop effective hybrid and multi-cloud practices in order to operate workloads across all of them. And a critical part of operating effectively across all these environments is having a basis for placing data and workloads into the venues that are best suited to deliver the outcomes that organizations have in mind for these transformation and modernization initiatives. So in our surveys, we ask businesses about, what factors are most important to them when they're making these decisions about where the best venue in which to execute a workload is. The most common responses talk about the requirements of the application, so things like performance, security, and dependencies, so privacy and data protection issues, and then the needs of the business, so things like agility or time to market, regulatory requirements, and then IT skills or the lack thereof, then financial considerations, which could include cost as well as, the available pricing models. So these are some of the initiatives that are driving organizations, some of the platform developments that those initiatives are introducing, and some of the important workload placement considerations that are coming along with that. Rather than, me spend too much time talking here, I wanted to get right into the conversation with Bryn. Bryn, I'd like to start by putting a question to you. So with all the options in front of them, what kinds of misconceptions have you seen organizations bring to their cloud efforts? Or what kinds of challenges are they encountering?
Yeah, great question, Liam. I think what I would start with is that this concept of misconception. I love that word. So when people say cloud, they automatically couple that conversation with the hyperscalers, right? And I think for me, that's the biggest misconception straight out of the gate, right? Cloud is a way of doing something. It's a behavior. It's a framework. You talk about cloud-based architecture. Cloud can be on-prem. It can be private. It can be in the metro. It doesn't have to be in the hyperscaler. Right? Hyperscaler is a great zone. It's a great, and to mimic you back a little bit here, chap, it's a great venue to deliver a digital interaction. Absolutely, 100% agree. But it's not the only venue. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was with a group of CIOs at the forum. Everybody was talking about cloud. But actually, what they were talking was about the hyperscalers. And I think, so for me, the first and probably the biggest misconception is there is more than just the hyperscalers. There is many different venues where we can deliver digital interactions to achieve a business outcome. And that's when we start thinking about other sort of, let's call it buzzwords in the marketplace, things like edge, as an example. And really what we should be focusing on from a leadership perspective is this concept of a compute continuum from the cloud, from the hyperscalers, all the way to the physical site. And I think your data shows that, to be frank, Liam, right, as part of the responses you got back from the market. And I mean, I guess to kind of pivot back to you a little bit off the back of that. So if we're grounded on the concept of there is a more of a continuum of compute, how do you think organizations are beginning to solve for that? Because ultimately you're now leaning into the world of hybrid and multi-cloud architectures. And I'd be really keen to get your lens on that from what you're seeing in the market, sir.
Sure. And then, and this notion of hybrid and multi-cloud is absolutely something that we're focused on understanding. And it's a line of inquiry that we're always pursuing in these surveys and in the conversations that we have with enterprise. I think what we hear in both cases, hybrid and multi-cloud, is that, most organizations expect to be operating in a hybrid environment going forward, meaning they're choosing to have workloads that they run on premises and workloads that they run in public cloud and as you mentioned, edge or other kinds of hosted environments. And the other thing is that those things aren't necessarily constants, because for many of those companies, the function that they want to create out of a hybrid environment is a system that supports the mobility of workloads, that I can move a workload to an environment that I consider to be the best fit or the best venue when the needs of the application or the needs of the business change, which they may over time. And then the other thing that we're consistently hearing is there is an intent to operate in a multi-cloud mode where the organizations prefer to work with multiple different public cloud vendors, in some cases 3 or 4 or even more, with the common explanation for that being, they want the opportunity to take advantage of the key features of the individual platforms. Although I will say that another common detail is that frequently we see people say they expect to have the majority of their public cloud workloads operating on what they consider to be their primary vendor. So I think having a hybrid or multi-cloud circumstance or having a hybrid or multi-cloud ambition is one thing, but having an intentional sort of drive toward executing that, and operating that effectively is kind of another. And so to put it back to you, when an organization is thinking about hybrid or multi-cloud, what kinds of components do they need to consider? What do they need to do in order to get that right and to do it effectively?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, because I think the first thing I'm going to start with, it may be a bit of a random one, is culture. So think about the agenda of the individuals that you're engaging with to go and have this conversation, right? Because it's quite a grown-up conversation you're now having. It's saying, right, I'm going to deliver some workloads with you, or on a technology that you prefer, but there are other workloads I'm not. I'm going to go and move them somewhere else, and you're not going to get purview of it, because again, that is the essence of multi-cloud. So I think, culture. Am I working with the right supply chain? Have I got the right teams within my organization as well, both internally and externally? Has everybody got a level set agenda here to make sure that we all understand the objective here is genuinely to experience a whole compute continuum, a whole multi-cloud experience, and it's not actually we're all just going to go and put it with this one hyperscaler, or we're going to put this all in one data center. I think, to me, that's the first thing. The second thing is not to get carried away with technology. look, we're all technologists here. We all get excited about technology, but we need to temper that. We need to understand that sometimes the shiniest, best new technology is not necessarily the right answer, as part of this. Because, I've got customers that have gone to the cloud, and I've got customers that are pulling workloads out of the cloud. And when I talk about the cloud, I should probably say the hyperscaler based on our first comment. But anyway, in the hyperscaler, I'm pulling out of a hyperscaler now. And again, this comes back to what is forming your decision. So make sure you're aligned with the outcomes that you're looking for from that application experience. So I did a previous survey working on Edge last year, and it was something along the lines of 80% of Edge proof of concepts failed. Why did they fail? When you start digging behind the data, it was because there was no business KPIs aligned to that data. So people were adopting technology but not understanding what they were trying to solve for. So you've got the culture, you've got the agenda, and it's making sure you're aligned with your business partners to understand the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's CX, sometimes it's digital experience. But you need to have that documented. So for me, they're the biggies when we start thinking about it. But again, it's all part of a journey. There's multiple different challenges that come as part of it. So there's no easy button, right? If there was an easy button, everybody would be doing it. So Liam, if you could share just some insights. So I have a certain lens. I'd be really keen to understand the lens that you have when you're engaging with customers, understanding what are the critical challenges they're seeing as they try to enable this journey, as it were, sir.
Sure. So this could be its own very long conversation, right? I think an interesting and a good place to start there is, to understand, and I think you sort of, set this up really nicely, is to understand why companies are adopting cloud or what they think they're going to accomplish with it. And frankly, it's probably worthwhile for some of the companies that have already begun adopting cloud or that have some of these things in place to re-examine that for themselves to, as you said, create some really clear metrics for understanding, is this working? Is this effective? Most of the companies that we survey tell us that they're putting things in cloud with, some combination of the same objectives, which are improvements in agility, in performance, in cost, in availability, in security, and maybe a few other things like that. And although, cloud is certainly a means to accomplishing each of those things, it's not necessarily going to do it out of the box. Complexity, as I mentioned earlier, is a challenge that is pretty baked into public cloud platforms. The hyperscalers have thousands and thousands of product configurations, and most of them view the pace at which they roll out new features as being a selling point. But even at the same time, it's a source of complexity. It's a source of, friction for some of the organizations that are trying to take advantage of this stuff. We ask companies what's getting in the way of them using cloud more or using it more effectively. And the top responses to that kind of survey question is a really similar list to that list of objectives. So it's things like security, controlling the cost, making accommodations for data sovereignty, the lack of expertise within the organization or fears about vendor lock-in. And then specifically when we ask them, what kinds of challenges are you trying to solve, or which kinds of challenges are you actively working to solve right now and don't feel like you have solved? Most of our survey respondents tell us they don't feel like they're being effective in optimizing their cloud environments for cost or optimizing them for performance. So I think we'll see, as you said, organizations, finding other ways to succeed in the cloud, or potentially finding situations where other venues are better for delivering some of those outcomes. Let me ask you, where are you seeing the companies that you work with getting some of those wins or arriving at some of those business objectives? What are the sort of avenues to success that you're seeing?
I think it goes back to that agility statement. It's really interesting. Have you ever noticed whenever any of us talk about cloud, we all use the itty words, agility. It's supposed to imply it's easy, but I think where customers have been successful, they've dug in below that agility conversation, right? Because I think for me, that's just a big blanket statement. Yeah. They've said, I want the ability to move into a new market. I want it to look like X, Y, and Z. And they've been able to quantify the impacts of those, right? But again, it's really understanding what lies underneath those business objectives. So I think it was, you start with that kind of board level conversation. We want agility. Well, okay, what does that mean? We want to go down a few layers. We want to dig into it. We really want to understand what that means to me as an organization. Yeah. So if you can imagine, it's a bit like this iceberg, right? You've got the broad statements, but the companies that understood actually 90% of the effort's below the waterline, right? So it's about putting that governance and control into place to make sure I achieve those objectives. And it's making sure they come back time and time again and continue to keep tuning that environment. If I was to ask that answer this in an inverse way, I've sat with many a customer that have gone, yeah, I moved to the hyperscaler. It was good. Yeah. I moved my data center from here. It's now in the cloud. And so, well, actually, you really haven't moved to the cloud. What you've done, you've just digitized your data center. You've just moved it from A to B. You're just using someone else's compute, right? But the ones that have been successful have said, right, I've looked at my application architecture. I understand which ones are monolithic, right? I've then triaged those ones to understand which ones am I going to kill? Which ones am I going to keep? How am I going to lean into, for instance, microservices? How am I going to build agile applications? And those are the customers that have been successful, but they've put that governance in place. And again, I'm going to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago. From a SKU perspective, the hyperscalers are throwing out SKUs after SKU after SKU. The customers that have been successful have leaned into organizations who have that knowledge base to keep coming back. So for me, it's not there's no A to B. It's for customers that understand it's a constant evolution of a journey of the ones that have been successful. And that's where I'm seeing success in the marketplace. So I think that hopefully that gives you some frame of reference as part of this. But again, that's where I'm seeing the success right now. But for me, the headwind I see is skill sets. Because again, let's go back to that statement about SKUs, right? So AWS, how many SKUs have they released this year? I would hate to think. It's a big number, right? And the thing that I always challenge customers on is, well, how are you managing that with the skill sets? How are you finding people to enable you to genuinely leverage the cloud experience? And Liam, I'd love to get your view on that, my friend.
Yeah, sure. So, we know that cloud skills are specialized skills. As you said, it's not just about dropping dropping an identical environment into the public cloud and calling that cloud. I mean, it's really about embracing the features and functions of those platforms. And, of course, the big public cloud providers, the hyperscalers themselves go to great lengths to provide information and training to develop those cloud skills. But I think we find that for many companies, those skills can be difficult to acquire, difficult to retain. I mentioned earlier that skills gaps is one of our top, responses that we get when we ask, what's in the way of you doing this more or doing this more effectively? And of course, and we see that there's a very big market of service providers that operate within the cloud ecosystem, offering to solve exactly the challenges that we're describing. And they're doing it via, professional services or managed services, doing, assessment of your environment, some of that triage you're talking about, designing more modern implementations, handling migration, doing implementation, doing ongoing operations, security, optimization, all of these things that we're talking about. And we know companies use those services because this market is large and it continues to grow. But on the other hand, a lot of the organizations that we talk to in our surveys for several years, or for quite a few years now, we've been seeing a pretty consistent level of resistance to the idea of handing off some of these things to a managed service, or to the idea that, parts of this skill set might exist outside the walls of your organization. But I have seen, I would say over the last maybe 1 to 2 years, we've seen what I would maybe call like an accelerated acceptance of the idea that outside help in planning, in executing, and in operating digital transformation or modernization initiatives via, more cloudy environments across whatever venue those might be. In our most recent results, about 2/3 of companies say they're using some type of managed service in connection with workloads that they're running in clouds. Almost all of them agree with the idea that these services are becoming more important to them over time. I think there are many factors in that. And I wouldn't discount, some of the workforce consequences that came with COVID as being part of that as well. But I think this collective set of initiatives, objectives, challenges, and skills gaps that we're talking about today is collectively kind of driving organizations in the direction of where else can I find this work. So maybe this is a good point for us to switch to some of the audience questions and do a little bit of Q&A here. And we've got a question here that relates exactly to what we're just talking about, which is, what kinds of skills or capabilities or areas of expertise have the biggest impact for companies when it comes to cloud, or getting what they want from cloud?
Yeah. That's an interesting one, because I wouldn't actually say it's about skills per se. For me, it's more about experience, right? So it's about making sure whoever's getting you on that journey, be that your internal teams or external provider, is outcome focused, right? And again, I've seen this journey to cloud so many times where people just become myopically focused on the technology, or they get focused on, I've got an agreement with that hyperscaler, I need to fulfill that hyperscaler. There's some sort of agenda in there, and they completely miss the point of what they're trying to do. And again, it's about the outcome they're striving for. So I think that, to me, is the first piece as part of that sort of skills. Let's call it a philosophy about the approaches. You've got to have an outcome-based focus. It's got to be measurable, and you've got to be able to fail fast, keep coming back to it, tuning it. So to me, that's the first piece. The second piece is about, when you think about skills, there is a lot of complexity in the cloud, okay, and the hyperscalers. The hyperscalers spend millions of dollars a year telling you it's easy and automated. But the reality of it is, if you're managing multiple different hyperscalers, you're managing multiple different software as a service vendors, you've got all this data moving around your world, there's an inordinate amount of complexity there. For me, the next bit is acknowledge that there's complexity here, right? So I see so many business cases with customers where they've completely underestimated the amount of resources actually to manage these types of worlds. Right? If I just focus on the hyperscaler world is very easy to turn on, yeah, but you have to remember to turn off. And I'm going to go back to that iceberg. Underneath that iceberg, 90% of it sits underneath the water. That's governance, that's control, that's SecOps, that's FinOps. How are you driving that back in? So it's not just about, for me, skills per se, but it's making sure you either have leaned into a partner to deliver it for you. If you're doing it yourself, have I sized the organization correctly? Do I understand what it means to deliver this service 24/7? Because there's going to be a high dependency on that service probably. And then have I built functional controlled areas underneath that to continue to do lifecycle management of that environment? Because again, when you're in a data center and it's your physical server, it's a fixed cost. It's very easy for you to constrain that. You're not in that world anymore. You're in a consumption-based world. How do you manage that? Have you got the right skills and resources around to deliver that? So to me, they're the two key areas before you go into, do I have enough DBAs and so on and so forth. You have to start there first.
Yeah. I see there's another question here about, from which types or where should organizations go to acquire these, these managed and professional services? What types of organizations are stepping up to provide this, this skills augmentation? you know, we do a lot of surveying of service providers, or a lot of conversation with service providers as well, and they definitely see this as an opportunity to provide value. And I think that goes for service providers across the board. Frankly, we see MSPs, telcos, system integrators, data center companies, even software and hardware companies kind of, you know, gathering around this idea of wanting to be the sort of trusted advisor to supporting these kind of initiatives around, you know, transformation or modernization, or adapting to the requirements of cloud, or shaping those to the needs of your organization. And, you know, this is actually probably a good, you know, a nice idea to kind of bring us in toward the conclusion on. But I think it really speaks to this idea that, you know, this is a really holistic undertaking. You're not just going to change one piece of organizational IT, just to what you were just talking about, and start seeing dividends without really, you know, considering the rest of what's going on and how its impacts sort of ripple out across the organization. And from the other side of the equation, I think service providers are seeing that, you know, they're not going to be able to completely succeed at some narrow task that's being asked of them without having some influence over the bigger picture of what these organizations are doing. So there's obviously a limited, you know, opportunity to be a trusted advisor to one of your customers. There's a limited number of seats at that table. But we're definitely seeing service providers of many kinds sort of shifting their attention to assuming that kind of role. And that's leading to a lot of, you know, collaboration and cooperation and even acquisition in the space. And yeah, I think we're kind of at time here, but I would say that, you know, my take, and Bryn, I'll give you a chance to sort of offer some closing wisdom as well. Yeah. But, you know, I would say that, you know, cloud is no longer a distinct space within IT, and that compartmentalizing this stuff isn't really producing business results. You know, cloud objectives are organizational objectives, and cloud challenges are organizational challenges, and sort of embracing this holistic overall shift is really how organizations are going to see change and see outcomes. You know, do you have anything else that you want to share?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, what I would say, you're sat at that table, you're making those decisions. Just be cognizant of the agendas at that table. And what I mean by that is, you want to be working with partners that genuinely do partner, okay, that do deliver a holistic approach, that are going to be open to any of these. I'm going to go back to a word you used right at the beginning of this venue. Yeah. So you want to be working with partners that will work with you to find the best venue to execute that digital interaction. And I think about, from my lens within NTT, I genuinely think we're agnostic. So you want to find an agnostic partner who can work with you, who isn't driven by some sort of consumption-based model, isn't driven by some form of investment in technology, who are going to do the best for you. So that, to me, was the biggest bit of focus. If I was making a buying decision as an enterprise right now, who's at that table with me? What are their agendas? Are they aligned to my business outcomes? And are they focused on making me successful? Not necessarily focused on the technology, because your success comes first, and then we talk about the technology that enables that. So that'll be my takeaway, Liam, from this.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Bryn, for you know, engaging in this way. Thanks to everyone who joined today, and if you submitted questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, we'll do our best to follow up on those sort of offline later. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you all.